What if the organizations that claim to help the world's poorest are the ones keeping them trapped in a cycle of dependency? What if the aid pouring into Africa isn't about lifting people, but about maintaining control over a continent rich with resources? Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao, former African Union ambassador to the United States, has become a powerful voice against what she calls the hypocrisy of foreign aid in Africa. Specifically, she's zeroed in on the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, which she describes as a wolf in sheep's clothing.
They are coming in claiming that they are introducing grassroots initiatives that are going to help the people. And so they use that as a way to go into the most remote parts of Africa. They're talking about government advocacy. When you look at it on paper, it all looks really good, but they're actually wolf in sheep's clothing. They are using that open access sounding humanitarian to constantly destabilize governments. I can tell you right now, the majority of African leaders, and not just African leaders, but leaders in the developing world, are celebrating the exit of USAID. I was listening to a program, I believe it was CNN, and I was jumping up and down. It was a government official from Hungary. He was echoing the same sentiment. He said they are happy USAID is leaving Hungary because they are always supporting opposition.
On the surface, USAID presents itself as a savior, offering humanitarian help to lift Africa out of poverty. But Chihombori-Quao argues that beneath this image lies a much darker reality. USAID, according to her, isn't just about aid. It's a tool of political manipulation, undermining Africa's sovereignty and fueling instability across the continent. So, is their aid helping? Let's find out. Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao's assertion that the U.S. Agency for International Development USAID is a wolf in sheep's clothing is more than just an accusation. It's a challenge to the very foundation of how the world views foreign aid. To understand why she uses such a stark description, one must look at the underlying tactics USAID employs in Africa, especially its political maneuverings, which often go unnoticed by the general public. On the outside, USAID projects appear like lifelines to struggling nations, offering humanitarian aid and development programs. But as Chihombori-Quao suggests, this aid often comes with strings attached, strings that ultimately tie African nations to a web of foreign influence that's anything but liberating. In many African countries, USAID presents itself as the provider of essential services, building schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, while offering aid in the form of food and medical supplies during times of crisis. For any outsider looking in, these programs would seem to be acts of generosity, righteous efforts to bring Africa into the modern world. But Chihombori-Quao argues that the true nature of USAID's involvement is far more insidious. The organization, in her view, operates under the guise of altruism, but often works to undermine the sovereignty of African nations by destabilizing their governments and promoting foreign interests over local needs. At the core of Chihombori-Quao's critique lies the belief that USAID is not just an aid agency, but a tool for political influence. In many African countries, USAID has been accused of funding opposition groups and destabilizing governments that do not align with Western interests. Chihombori-Quao highlights several instances where the U.S. has used aid as leverage, pushing governments to adopt policies that benefit the West, often at the cost of their citizens. Take, for example, the decades-long involvement of USAID in countries like Sudan and Zimbabwe, where the agency has been accused of not just providing aid, but also supporting regimes or rebel movements that align with U.S. foreign policy objectives. USAID's support for opposition forces in these countries, often hidden under the blanket of humanitarian assistance, undermines local governments and destabilizes the political landscape. Chihombori-Quao argues that these interventions weaken African nations, preventing them from making independent decisions that serve their people. Moreover, USAID's long-term presence in African countries has led to a dependency on foreign aid, which allows the West to maintain influence over local economies and politics. By controlling the flow of aid, USAID can effectively dictate the course of a nation's development. Chihombori-Quao believes that this dependency on foreign assistance traps African nations in a cycle of stagnation, where they are unable to foster sustainable growth and become self-reliant. This dependency on foreign aid comes with significant consequences. Chihombori-Quao emphasizes that by relying on external sources of support, African governments often neglect to build their systems and infrastructures, which are essential for long-term growth. Instead of focusing on internal economic development and governance, many African countries find themselves constantly looking to the West for assistance. But what does this mean for the average African citizen? Well, in many cases, the benefits of aid trickle down slowly, if at all. While USAID projects might help on the surface, such as providing food during a famine or building roads in remote areas, these efforts rarely lead to sustainable changes. Over time, the aid is seen as a temporary solution rather than a lasting fix, perpetuating a cycle of dependency. Africa, in Chihombori-Quao's view, is a continent with abundant resources, both human and natural, and the capability to sustain its population. However, instead of tapping into these resources, the aid system forces African nations to rely on outside assistance. This dependency also comes with political strings attached. Governments that accept USAID funding are often pressured to align with Western political goals. This may include supporting international policies that favor the US or other Western nations, often in exchange for continued aid. In essence, the US uses aid to buy influence, ensuring that African leaders remain beholden to foreign powers rather than focusing on the interests of their people. Despite the decades of investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure by USAID, the results have been disappointing. Chihombori-Quao argues that the agency's track record in Africa is far from impressive. The billions of dollars poured into the continent have not brought about the promised development. Schools built with USAID funding may have created some access to education, but the quality of that education often leaves much to be desired. Healthcare programs funded by USAID have certainly provided short-term relief in times of crisis, but they fail to address the root causes of healthcare deficiencies in many African countries. Chihombori-Quao believes that this is part of a broader issue with the way foreign aid operates in Africa. It offers quick fixes to symptoms, but not solutions to the systemic problems. For example, building schools or healthcare facilities is valuable, but without investing in the local economy or in the capacity of governments to manage and maintain these systems, the improvements remain superficial. In this way, USAID's work often fails to create the kind of transformative change that is needed for real progress. So why does USAID continue to be so deeply embedded in African countries? According to Chihombori-Quao, it's because of a fundamental issue. Africa's dependence on foreign aid has become institutionalized. The cycle of aid undermines Africa's ability to chart its course and create a future based on its resources. In a world where global powers like the US are heavily invested in shaping the political and economic trajectories of the developing world, USAID serves as a crucial tool to maintain that influence. But as Chihombori-Quao points out, this help comes at a cost that Africa has been paying for far too long. So, does foreign aid truly serve the interests of the African people, or does it merely serve the agendas of those who provide it? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Chihombori-Quao believes that the very existence of foreign aid from the West undermines Africa's sovereignty. On the surface, aid is presented as a selfless effort to alleviate poverty, build infrastructure, and improve health and education. But as African countries continue to rely on the West for financial and logistical support, their ability to make independent decisions diminishes. Aid organizations, with their deep pockets and vast resources, hold significant leverage over African governments, often pushing them to align with Western political, economic, and military priorities. The result is a continent that remains dependent manipulated, and politically subordinated to foreign powers. There's a paradox at the heart of the foreign aid system. While Western governments and NGOs tout their efforts to help African nations, the reality is that aid has created a state of dependency. For decades, countries across the continent have relied on foreign aid to fund everything from basic infrastructure projects to long-term development initiatives. But this dependence has come at a cost, namely the stifling of local industry, agriculture, and governance. Rather than empowering African nations to take control of their development, foreign aid has often placed them in a perpetual cycle of reliance on the West. One key example of this is in the agricultural sector. Africa is rich in fertile land, natural resources, and a labor force that could feed the continent and the world. However, Chihombori-Quao argues that instead of empowering African farmers to sustain their agricultural industries, foreign aid has often undermined local food systems. One of the most glaring examples is the introduction of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, by aid organizations like USAID, which promises to increase food production in Africa. While this may seem like a positive step, the consequences have been far-reaching. GMOs are presented by foreign aid organizations as a solution to food insecurity, offering the promise of higher yields and more resistant crops. Yet, according to Chihombori-Quao, these genetically engineered crops have proven to be more harmful than helpful to Africa's agricultural landscape. She argues that the use of GMOs has led to soil degradation, forcing African farmers to rely on foreign seeds year after year, as the soil becomes less fertile with each planting. After a single season of growing GMOs, the soil loses its ability to produce viable crops, leaving local farmers dependent on imported seeds and chemical fertilizers. This pattern creates a vicious cycle. Farmers in Africa, rather than growing crops suited to their local environments, are now trapped by foreign technology that undermines their independence. It's not just about food security. It's about the ability of African nations to maintain control over their food systems. Chihombori-Quao suggests that this dependence on GMOs and foreign agricultural methods has not only destroyed local ecosystems, but also handed over the continent's agricultural sovereignty to multinational corporations who control the seeds, the chemicals, and ultimately, the food supply. But the damage doesn't end there. By relying on foreign aid, Africa's agricultural sector, one of its most important industries, is unable to thrive on its own. Chihombori-Quao argues that rather than investing in sustainable agricultural practices and building up local industries, foreign aid perpetuates a system where African nations are forced to import the very food they could grow themselves. In essence, this aid keeps African nations economically and politically tethered to the West. Another critical area where Chihombori-Quao sees foreign aid undermining Africa's sovereignty is in the realm of economic development. Much of the foreign aid flowing into Africa is allocated to infrastructure projects such as roads, dams, and buildings. While these projects are vital for economic growth, they often come with strings attached. For instance, many of these projects are funded through loans or grants from foreign governments or international financial institutions, which are then required to use foreign companies and labor. This means that while Africa is investing in infrastructure, much of the wealth generated by these projects ends up in foreign hands, not local ones. Take China, for example. While its economic ties with Africa have been lauded for promoting infrastructure development, critics argue that these relationships often involve heavy debt burdens that African countries may struggle to repay. Countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Zambia have taken on massive loans from Chinese banks for projects like railways and airports. However, these debts often come with high interest rates, and the construction contracts are typically awarded to Chinese companies, leaving little room for local businesses to benefit. Chihombori-Quao points out that this pattern isn't isolated to China but is endemic in the Western-backed aid system as well. The foreign aid system, therefore, has created a structure where African nations are not able to independently fund and execute their development projects. Instead, they are caught in a web of debt, reliant on foreign powers and corporations to drive the economic development of their countries. Rather than developing self-sustaining economies, African nations are increasingly locked into systems that leave them vulnerable to external control. multinational corporations have a vested interest in maintaining Africa's dependency on foreign aid. These corporations often act as the middlemen, benefiting from the contracts awarded by Western governments and NGOs. For example, construction firms, tech companies, and agricultural giants frequently win lucrative contracts funded by foreign aid. However, these companies often prioritize profit over the welfare of the African people, leading to projects that benefit the few at the expense of the many. Chihombori-Quao argues that this creates an environment where the needs of African citizens are subordinated to the desires of multinational corporations and foreign governments. These corporations not only benefit from the direct financial inflow, but also gain access to Africa's vast resources. Chihombori-Quao highlights how foreign companies, backed by aid funding, extract Africa's resources while contributing very little to the continent's economic independence or growth. In the end, Chihombori-Quao's critique of foreign aid is a call for Africa to take control of its destiny. Rather than continuing to accept aid that perpetuates dependency, she believes it's time for African nations to stand up, reclaim their sovereignty, and harness their resources. The true cost of aid is not just financial, it is the loss of power and autonomy that comes with it. Africa must break free from the chains of foreign influence and move towards self-sufficiency, because until it does, the cycle of dependency will continue, and true progress will remain out of reach. So, what if Africa could rise above the chains of foreign influence? What if African nations could thrive on their resources, without the need for aid from the West, and without surrendering their sovereignty to external powers? For decades, Africa has been portrayed as a continent in need of constant assistance, whether in the form of food, infrastructure, or humanitarian aid. But this narrative is increasingly being challenged by voices like Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao, who argue that Africa's future doesn't need to be written by foreign powers, corporations, or aid organizations. Instead, the future of Africa lies in reclaiming its resources, its sovereignty, and its development pathways. Africa, Chihombori-Quao insists, is more than capable of sustaining itself, and it's time for African leaders to take the reins of their destinies, free from the constraints of foreign influence. The idea of African self-sufficiency isn't just a lofty dream, it is a practical and necessary shift in the global power dynamic. Over the years, African nations have been trapped in a cycle of dependency, where aid from the West has been seen as the only viable route for progress. Yet, as Chihombori-Quao's critique suggests, this cycle has only stifled real growth and prevented Africa from tapping into its vast potential. The question now is not whether Africa can become self-sufficient, but rather how it can break free from foreign aid and begin to thrive on its terms. Africa's wealth is undeniable. The continent is home to an abundance of natural resources: gold, oil, diamonds, fertile land, and a young, dynamic population. Yet despite this wealth, many African countries continue to struggle with poverty, underdevelopment, and inequality. How is it that a continent so rich in resources is also home to some of the world's most impoverished nations? The answer lies in the control of these resources. For decades, foreign powers and multinational corporations have been the primary beneficiaries of Africa's natural wealth. Whether it's the extraction of minerals by foreign companies or the exploitation of Africa's agricultural potential, the true value of these resources has largely remained outside the continent. Chihombori-Quao's vision for Africa's future involves a fundamental shift in how these resources are managed. She believes that African nations must take control of their resources, rather than allowing foreign entities to continue extracting wealth without benefiting the local population. This requires a long-term commitment to building local industries, strengthening infrastructure, and creating policies that prioritize African citizens over external interests. For example, rather than allowing foreign corporations to extract raw materials, African nations could focus on developing industries that process these materials locally, creating jobs and adding value to their resources. This would not only strengthen Africa's economy, but also reduce its dependence on imports and aid. The road to self-sufficiency requires Africa to invest in its industries. Over the years, foreign aid has often supported infrastructure projects that benefit international companies more than local populations. roads and railways are often built to transport Africa's resources to foreign markets, while the jobs created by these projects are often short-term and low-paying, with little long-term benefit for local communities. To break free from this cycle, African nations must build industries that serve local needs first and foremost. Take, for example, the agricultural sector, which has been largely neglected in favor of foreign-driven farming methods and imports. If Africa invested in its agricultural research and infrastructure, it could become a global leader in sustainable farming. Chihombori-Quao emphasizes the importance of empowering African farmers using indigenous knowledge and practices that work in harmony with the land, rather than relying on foreign technology like GMOs. Furthermore, Africa has the potential to be a manufacturing hub, producing goods for its people and export. While much of Africa's industrialization has been limited, there are success stories. Countries like Ethiopia and Kenya have started to build their textile industries, and Rwanda has made strides in developing its technology sector. These initiatives are proof that with the right investment, Africa can foster its industries and reduce its reliance on imported goods. To make self-sufficiency a reality, Africa must also strengthen its governance structures. Chihombori-Quao stresses that African leaders must be accountable to their people, not to foreign donors or multinational corporations. This requires a shift in how African governments approach development. Rather than focusing on securing aid and foreign investment, African governments must prioritize policies that empower local communities and businesses. This may involve tough decisions, such as rejecting foreign aid that comes with strings attached or refusing trade deals that favor foreign interests. It also means being transparent and accountable to the people, ensuring that resources are used to benefit local communities rather than being siphoned off by corrupt officials or foreign companies. African leaders must foster an environment where economic growth is inclusive and sustainable, rather than serving the interests of a select few. While individual nations have the power to become self-sufficient, there is also strength in unity. Pan-Africanism, the idea that African nations should work together for the collective good of the continent, is a powerful tool in achieving self-sufficiency. Chihombori-Quao advocates for increased cooperation between African countries, arguing that collective action is essential for breaking free from foreign influence. By creating stronger regional economic ties and a unified political voice, African nations can amplify their bargaining power on the global stage, ensuring that their interests are prioritized over those of external powers. This could involve initiatives such as greater economic integration through the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA), which aims to increase intra-Africa trade and reduce reliance on foreign markets. By working together, African countries can create a more resilient and self-sustaining continent, where trade and investment flow within the continent rather than being dependent on foreign countries. The vision Chihombori-Quao puts forward for Africa is one of empowerment, independence, and self-sufficiency. It is a future where Africa no longer relies on foreign aid to meet its basic needs, but instead takes control of its resources and its future. This vision requires bold leadership, long-term planning, and a commitment to sustainable development that puts the needs of African people first. Africa's potential is vast, and the tools to achieve self-sufficiency are within reach. It is not a matter of capability, but of will. If African nations can break free from the cycle of dependency and embrace the power of their resources, the continent can chart a new course, one where it is no longer a recipient of aid, but a leader in the global economy. Africa's path to self-sufficiency is not an easy one, but it is essential. By reclaiming control over its resources, building local industries, and strengthening governance, Africa can break free from the chains of foreign aid and create a future of true independence. As Chihombori-Quao envisions, the future of Africa lies not in the hands of foreign powers, but in the hands of its people, empowered, sovereign, and self-sufficient. Do you think Africa should accept aid? Has aid ever helped anyone become self-dependent? Let us know in the comments section. If this is not the time to take control, then when? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.